Why did Welby really resign? And why should he actually have resigned many years ago? Well, perhaps some of you have seen a video by Glenn Scrivener, a good friend of mine. We've been on each other's platforms, we've worked together, we talk together, and I love the guy. But I'm going to disagree with him. You may have seen this video that he's put out there saying essentially the resignation is quite simply about the Macon report, and moreover, we're not allowed to talk about anything else at this time. Now, I'm going to respectfully, lovingly disagree with Glenn on some points here, and I believe they're important points. Please hear me out. There are basically two main areas. If you haven't seen the video, recommend you go and watch it. I think the second half of the video in particular is fantastic. Glenn really helpfully lays out the lessons we do need to learn from the Macon report, and that's really important stuff. So do go and listen to the video. But essentially, there are two areas that I want to look into here by way of response, because I think it's really important we don't miss what's really going on here, and the various ways in which conversations need to be put forward and extended. And it's not actually a time to limit the conversation only to one thing. So hear me out. Let me try and explain what I want to do here. So first off, Glenn tells us really to take Justin Welby's resignation letter at face value. It is what it says on the tin. So Justin told us himself why he's resigning. It's all because of the Macon report. He's gone honourably, says Glenn, if late. And he's told us where to focus. He's told us all what we need to be looking at now in the light of his resignation, which is the Macon report. That's the first thing I want to look at. The second thing I want to look at is what Glenn goes on to say, which is, and if we talk about anything else at this time, we dishonour the victims, we prove that we are tribally motivated, we are bandwagoning, and we're jumping on our hobby horses. Today is not the day to talk about other things, even if those things are important, even if we have views on those other things. Today is not the day. It's wrong to develop this conversation in any other way. This is what Welby's resignation is about, and it's nothing else. And we're meant to just accept that. I strongly disagree. We can, and indeed we must, extend. I don't say change. We're not changing subject, but we need to extend the conversation in the right ways. Otherwise, in fact, that's when we prove that we're not learning. So I want to, in a sense, make an opposite point to what Glenn is making. He says if we talk about anything else today, we prove we haven't learned the lessons. I want to say the opposite. If we don't extend this conversation in necessary ways, we prove we have not learned about it. It's also important to be honest and factually correct about the real reason Welby resigned, not take things at face value. And we also rightly need to assess Welby's whole tenure and indeed that of the wider established church, the Church of England, and the church at large. It is an important time to review not just one issue, but multiple issues. Now, please understand, I'm not saying that we should not be talking about the Macon report, the horrific abuse therein, what the victims went through, and how to prevent similar things from happening. Glenn is brilliant on this. He's very strong on the importance of getting help to the victims first, and he warns helpfully against personal piety only in that video. And he's absolutely right that the role of the shepherds really high up on the agenda is attacking the wolves, so the wolves don't attack the sheep. And that's important. And so I'm certainly not saying that today is not a day to be talking about the Macon report. We absolutely should be, and we must be. And thankfully, there are lots of people talking about it. Thankfully, it's in The Spectator, it's Channel 4, it's The Guardian. It's in fact every newspaper I've seen in the last few days. It's all the Christian media are talking about it. And that's good. They should be. It's great. It's good they're talking about it. I'm saying there's room for a bigger conversation. There's room for other stuff as well alongside that. Not just in addition, but actually it does belong with that conversation. There's a continuity and there's a connection and a relevance that we need to see. Otherwise, we prove we have not learnt the lessons. Okay, so I'm not saying we change the subject. I'm saying we extend the subject appropriately. I'll put it this way. If we do care, if indeed we care for the victims of Smythe and others, if we do care for them, and if we care for them for the right reasons, we should also care for other victims of abuse. Right? If reputation management is one of the key problems here, and Glenn very skillfully exposes that in his video and elsewhere, and all credit to Glenn, by the way, he's been talking about this for ages. He's not just talking about it now because it's been in the headlines. He really cares about this, and he's been doing a good job at exposing it. So all credit to him. But if, as he says, reputation is one of the reasons, reputation management is one of the reasons such horrific abuse is carried on, and even when people knew about it, they didn't want to talk about it, because what if that damages the reputation of the ministry or of the church or even of the gospel, even of Christ? And Glenn rightly says that's horrific. Jesus doesn't need our protection if that's what protection looks like. If reputation management is the issue, then we must look at where else reputation management is causing injustice and abuse to continue. Let me put it like this. Imagine if in the days following, after this Macon report, imagine it came to light there was another similar kind of abuse, another individual who abused dozens or scores of people in a similar way, and someone said, we need to look at this. Would they be changing the subject? Would that be inappropriate? Would that be dishonouring the victims listed in the Macon report? Well, of course not. In fact, you can't pretend to care about the victims in the Macon report if you don't also care about other victims of similar abuses. What does it mean to say we're learning from that if we don't apply our learning to prevent other injustices, or we don't show concern for other similar injustices? No one would accuse me or anyone of changing the subject, of getting on a hobby horse, of being tribalistic, if it came to light there was another similar abuse and we said, hey, we've seen the Macon report, we now need to talk about this as well. Similar problem happening for similar reasons. That would not be changing the subject. It's extending the subject in an appropriate way that shows we really do care about this kind of thing, and we're not just talking about it because it's in the news, which I'm not saying Glenn is doing. Glenn's been talking about this for a long time and he really cares, but it is not changing the subject, and it certainly isn't I can't see why that would be tribalistic. What's that got to do with a tribe? What's what I'm doing got to do with a tribe? And why should we not be talking about victims of other abuses if we really care about victims of abuse? If it's because they're image bearers, if it's because injustice is wrong, always injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. Let me bring this to home with a specific 31.8 safeguarding organisation. We've been asking them to include unborn children in their safeguarding policies, and we're not getting a response. So what's going on there? The unborn child, and this is not changing the subject, this is extending the subject. The unborn child is by far the most at-risk people group in the church and in society. The most likely to experience violence, the most likely to be killed by violence. Why wouldn't we include them in our safeguarding policies? I'm only changing the subject if the unborn are not human. If the unborn are human, this is an appropriate and indeed a necessary extension of the subject. If we care about abuse in the church, if we care about physical abuse in the church, violence, if we care about reputation management and comfort and not wanting to be seen as the bad guy, if we're concerned about all that stuff getting in the way of true justice, why would we not care about the injustice being done about babies? I am not changing the subject. This is another form of physical abuse in the church. If we don't extend our protection to every people group in the church, what does it mean to say we're learning the lessons? We've been avoiding the plight of the unborn for decades. If we continue to avoid it for another few decades, are we really learning the lessons? Now, I'm not saying we do this instead of tackling specifically the kind of abuse that Smythe was involved with. I'm not saying instead of. I'm saying as well as. When we have safeguarding protections for certain people groups, we're not saying they matter more than other people groups. We're just saying here's a group that's at risk. There is no group at risk more than the unborn child. I'm not changing the subject. I'm extending the conversation in an appropriate and a necessary way. If we refuse to extend it in this way, we prove that we haven't learned the lesson. We're just talking about this, and because it's all out in the open now, and because even the secular media agree, and again, Glenn rightly says, in God's providence, it was secular journalists who actually helped some of this to come to light. And yeah, I agree with him. There is an element of God's judgment there, and God does use unbelievers sometimes to judge the church, absolutely, to judge his people, for sure. So it's right that that's come to light, and it's shameful that it took people outside the church for it to come to light, and it's shameful that that's what it took for Welby to resign. I'll come on to that later on. But if we wait another 50 years until the Guardian and the Observer and the Telegraph and the Times and Channel 4 all together have come to a point of agreeing that abortion is wrong, it's the greatest injustice of our day, and only then does the sitting Archbishop at the time resign because he didn't do anything about it, and only then is everyone talking about how we need to learn the lessons in another 50 years' time, what good will it have been for that particular injustice, the injustice against the unborn child, which is numerically the greatest? I'm not saying it matters more. I'm not saying they matter more. I'm saying there are more of them, and they're more at risk. That's objectively true. Defend that to the death. There is no argument there. They are not more important than the victims of Smythe and whoever else, but there are more of them, and they are more at risk than people outside the womb. Now, if someone says, oh, you can't talk about that today, well, it's happening today. It's happening every day. More than 500 children killed every day, some of them in the church. Now, how many people are killed outside the womb in the church every day? I'm not changing the subject. In fact, we have all been burying our head in the sand about the greatest injustice, the greatest child abuse scandal of a lifetime, in fact, of all history. I am not changing the subject. The problem is that no one is talking about the greatest injustice of all time. And we even pretend, some of us, to be learning the lessons and so on and so forth, but actually we're making exactly the same mistakes day in, day out with this injustice. If we really learn, and we must, learn the lessons of the Macon Report, we will apply that not only to people in exactly the same situation or similar situations, but all people groups, if we really care. If we really care. We need to judge issues on their own merits. In a sense, I don't care what day it is. This is happening every day. It is not inappropriate to talk about this today if it's happening today. If you condemn racism against black people, it's not changing the subject to condemn racism against Chinese people, Indian people. That's not changing the subject. Rather, if you really hate racism, you'll hate racism against anyone. It's not changing the subject. And anyone who says it is still doesn't really understand the issue, I'm afraid. And all the issues, the interconnecting issues, or they're not facing up to the connections and the necessity of addressing all of them. There are more victims being treated, let's say, even worse. I'm not trivializing. It's possible to say something's horrific and something else is even more horrific. It's not trivializing suffering. It isn't. What happened to those Smythe victims? Horrific. What's happening to the unborn children is even more horrific. These unborn children are left dead. All of them. Abortions never fail in our country. Every child that gets targeted by abortion is killed. It's just objectively true. The violence is even greater, and it's in greater numbers. I'm not trivializing it. I'm saying yes, and how much more? Jesus said things like that. You shouldn't have neglected the greater matters of the law, justice, mercy, faithfulness, without neglecting the smaller ones, the less weighty ones. Jesus changed the subject. He said, you're looking at this, you want to talk about this, but I want to talk about this, because this is even more important. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not trivializing it. I'm glad that there are lots of people looking at this. It needs to be looked at. Thank you, there are good people like Glenn looking at it. Now it's in the public eye. Fantastic, it needs to be. But there are other things that also need to be in the public eye. And I'm not going to be silent about them, because it's apparently we're not allowed to talk about it today. More victims treated even worse, and the silence, the conspiracy of silence, is at least as great. Takes a different form, but I'll come on to this in the second half. It's at least as great, certainly in Welby's case. At least as great. We should learn the lessons from the Making report, and that includes tackling injustice everywhere. It includes seeing where reputation entertains and accommodates injustice anywhere. So I just disagree that to extend the conversation in relevant and appropriate ways dishonors the victims. You know, if this Making report represented the only abuse scandal going on at this time, or under Welby historically, but come to light under Welby's tenure, okay, that would be one thing. Changing the subject or whatever wouldn't be so appropriate. If it were the only or the most prolific, the most horrific, or if no one were talking about it, if it wasn't getting any airtime at all, okay, maybe it'd be inappropriate to talk about something else on the same day. But there are more victims, even more. Not trivializing, I'm saying, yes, that's horrific, and there are even more horrific injustices going on, particularly in the womb. And let's not say we care about injustice if we refuse to tackle the blind spot of our day. It's easier to look back at a blind spot, even from a few decades ago, where all the secular papers now agree with us, and so it's actually, yeah, it's somewhat easier to confront that injustice. Again, I'm not belittling it. It's a real injustice and it needs to be confronted. But we are not learning the lessons. This is what I'm saying. We're not learning the lessons unless we, as it were, put ourselves back a few decades and think, okay, at that time, this was a blind spot. They're managing the situation. What's our blind spot today? Now, there might be very similar blind spots today, similar kinds of abuse, but here's definitely a blind spot of today. Hundreds of babies being killed in the womb every day. The church doing almost nothing. That's a blind spot of today, and our reputation management is keeping a lid on that today. So let's not say we're learning the lessons if we don't apply it to the greatest injustice numerically, and whether that's politically correct to say or not, it's not deemed in keeping with the etiquette of the conversation. Well, it's happening, okay? It's happening, and we ignored it yesterday. We're ignoring it today. Are we going to ignore it tomorrow? If we ignore it tomorrow, we are not learning the lessons of the Making report. So I disagree. We're not dishonoring the victim. In fact, I say the opposite. We dishonor victims of injustice if we don't then take injustice everywhere seriously. We're not really learning. We're just agreeing with what everyone now agrees with, when actually it's too late for those victims. That's the tragedy. But it's not too late for the victims in the womb, day by day, if we will stand up and speak and act. So today is the day to talk about related injustice, even greater, numerically speaking, injustices. That's not trivializing. It's not even changing the subject. It's extending the subject. It's learning the lesson. So that's the first thing I want to say. We can and we must extend the conversation in relevant and necessary ways. The other thing I want to say is going back to that question of, well, why did Welby resign? Before that, let me just talk a little bit about Welby and this injustice. Because Welby has been dishonouring these victims also. He's been dishonouring the victims of Smythe and others, yes. He's also been dishonouring the victims of the injustice of the baby genocide, child sacrifice, for decades. And indeed the whole well-established church with him and much of the church full stop. In 1965, the Church of England wrote a draft Abortion Act. It helped David Steele to think through his Abortion Act, and ultimately helped the Abortion Act 1967 to get passed. David Steele referred to the 1965 Church of England Draft Abortion Act as the best document, together with the report that it was appended to, the most helpful thing he had read on the issue of abortion, helped him to become a pro-choice, as it were, Christian. The Church of England helped pass the Abortion Act. Where's the repentance? In 2014, a friend and colleague of mine spoke face-to-face with Justin Welby and made sure he was aware of this injustice. She put a leaflet into his hand that showed pictures of victims of this injustice, mutilated through surgical abortion, and Welby looked at these pictures, he saw them, and he gave a political answer at the time, as he always does. Oh, it's appalling, it's sad, but waffle, waffle, waffle. He's seen, he knows, he was put on notice, he knows. He has seen the victims of this injustice and done less than nothing. And I want to say less than nothing. He actually worked against them actively. Not only is there great silence when the Northern Ireland abortion issue came up and Westminster imposed abortion on Northern Ireland, where was Welby? Where was the so-called Lord Spiritual? Did you hear a word from him? Often the bishops abstained those votes. Certainly none of them spoke out against imposing child sacrifice on Northern Ireland against the will of the Northern Irish people. Welby didn't say a word. How many times have you heard Welby talk about climate change in the media, talk about immigration, talk about the EU and housing? Not a word against the greatest injustice of our day. I'm not saying the Smythe stuff doesn't matter. It matters. What I'm saying is this also matters. And Welby's even more culpable in this area. And we shouldn't actually let him get away, as it were, with just pinning his resignation on one thing when it clearly wasn't even about that anyway. I'll come on to that in a moment. But we must also look at, not just because of him, not even just because of the Church of England, but all of us have been sitting on this injustice for decades. And Welby's not only dropped the ball on it, he's actively supported it. When he was asked about buffer zones, which have just come into play across Great Britain, he said he supported them. He supports keeping life-saving information, help, prayer from mothers and babies right on the doorstep of these abortion centres. Hundreds of babies have been saved year on year through the brave work of many activists outside these clinics. Most of them just praying silently, approaching individuals who want to be approached to speak and offer them help. I get a newsletter from one of these organisations showing just rows and columns of names of babies saved that year. I wrote to Welby's office and I said, are you sure you support buffer zones? Here are the babies who are saved every year because people are near the clinics doing their work. Are you saying these babies should have been sacrificed and killed instead of saved? Is that what you're saying? They didn't change their mind. The office dug in. Welby thinks that, for example, Roman Catholics should be jailed for praying in a public space in Great Britain. Not only has he done nothing about child sacrifice, he supported it. He wants to keep a so-called safe space around the clinics where they're killing babies. He doesn't want anything to interfere with the business of killing babies. This is an egregious injustice. Horrific. Who needs enemies when you've got so-called friends like this? It's outrageous that anyone, let alone that would be a church discipline issue. For a Christian to support child sacrifice actively would be a church discipline issue. How much more are they unfit for leadership? But he's been sitting on this for years. I'm not changing the subject, I'm extending it. Ostensibly, Welby has resigned because he dropped the ball on a horrific injustice. Well, he more than dropped the ball on an even more horrific injustice. And we mustn't let that one slide. We've got to learn the lessons from that. And I just reject this idea that if we don't agree that today is the day to only talk about one thing, we don't care about the victims of Smythe. No, if we care about the victims of Smythe, we'll talk about injustice elsewhere also. Otherwise, do we really care about the victims of injustice? There's room for both and more conversations. One of the reasons Welby should have resigned ages ago is the way he's been sitting on this injustice. The injustice of what we call abortion, which is a euphemism. He's been waffling, he's been political. He says, yes, I believe in life conception, but it's so hard. And that's all you ever got from him, once or twice. And during his time, I think it's about 2 million babies have been killed during his tenure. 2 million. Can you even compute a number like 2 million? And not a word against it from Welby, not one word. So then I want to just come finally to that question of, well, why did he resign? Which in a sense is a less important question, but I think we need to look at it. Glenn in his video would have us believe that it's just what it says on the tin. He resigned because of the Macon report. He told us himself he left honourably, if late, and he's told us where to focus the conversation. I don't buy it for a minute that that's what Welby, what's going on in his heart and mind. Now, absolutely, take it as an opportunity to highlight the Macon thing, and yeah, ostensibly that's the context in which his resignation came about, and absolutely use it as an opportunity to highlight the injustice, to learn the lessons. Absolutely, that's justifiable. It's necessary, but let's not pretend that he can be taken at face value. Let's not pretend he all of a sudden just felt conviction and repentance on Monday night or whatever it was, when he already knew about this stuff for years, and even more recently he considered resigning, then no. And then the moment it was on all the headlines of all the newspapers, the moment the secular left-leaning liberal press were calling for his resignation, I knew he was going to do it. I just knew. It was obvious. Blindingly obvious he was going to go. He clung on as long as possible, tried to ride out the storm, thought it would blow over. The moment he realised that the Guardian and the Observer and the Telegraph and whatever else, once they were all up against him, it was obvious. It was obvious. It was no surprise that he resigned. I knew he would. It wasn't contrition. It wasn't about the victims. If he cared about the victims, he'd have met with them much sooner. He'd dealt with it much sooner. He knew about this for years. So let's not believe him just because he says it. We shouldn't be so naive. And again, that's not saying we shouldn't be talking about the Macon report. We should. I'm just saying let's not believe someone who lies so consistently, who waffles, who gives a political answer to everything, until eventually his time ran out. Let's not believe that. It was another example of the church following the world. And of course, he's been doing this his whole career as Archbishop, going with all the latest issues of the sort of left-leaning secular press. Utterly predictable. He didn't go because it was the right thing. It wasn't honourable. He went because the press told him to. He knew his time was up. It was just more the church following the world, where the church is meant to be a thermostat. It's a thermometer. And he's perhaps an extreme example of it, but it's what so much the church has been doing for so long. The world tells us, the world leads us morally, and it's to our shame. And Glenn's quite right. It's to our shame when the church is fairly and rightly called out by the world. But of course, it's like when a broken clock is correct twice every 24 hours. On this occasion, they were absolutely right. But a lot of the time, we're following them when they're wrong. And that's because there's no leadership. And what Welby's tenure has epitomised anti-leadership. There's no leadership, no spiritual leadership. It's just following and echoing. And his last act was absolutely in line with that. Just another one of being told what to do by the Guardian, etc. So it's obvious why he went. It wasn't contrition, wasn't repentance, wasn't because he cared. It's because his time was up, and he, as ever, was doing what the left-leaning media told him to do. In a sense, of course, it was the right thing to do for him to resign, but it was for the wrong reasons and way too late. I'm not saying that the Macon thing would have been the wrong reason. I'm saying that wasn't his reason. Just don't believe him when he says that was his reason. And if we're talking about fighting wolves, well, there's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Let's not be naive and act as though he suddenly got leadership and he's telling us where to focus, and it's for that reason we ought to be focusing on this conversation. No, we should be talking about that conversation, but not because Welby says so. No, he's only saying so because the Guardian says so. So let's not be duped. That's not learning the lessons. 50 years from now, will an archbishop be resigning in like manner because he knew about the genocide of babies and did nothing about it, and the secular press came out and called him out, and only then did he resign? Not because he suddenly cared about the babies, but because actually it took an unbelieving world to tell him what's right and wrong. And even then, it wasn't because he knew it was right or wrong, but just because that's what they're telling him to do. And he's a slave of the press. Is that what's going to happen in 50 years' time from now? It's been more than 50 years since the Abortion Act came into play, and no one has in that office has really done much against it, spoken against it. And I put it to you that we're not really learning from the Making Report. We're not really caring about the victims of abuse. We're not really caring about how reputation management gets in the way of justice if we don't extend that to all victims of all injustice, and especially the greatest injustice of our day, including in the church. We're not living out our theology that we believe that all people are made in the image of God from fertilization, regardless of size, sex, disability, whatever. We're not living out that theology, and we're not dying to reputation. So there's my response. That's why Welby really resigned. Just more of the same, being told what to do by the secular media, more reputation management, more doing what's right in the world's eyes. That was the real reason, the honest reasoning. And here's why he should have gone. One of the reasons he should have gone ages ago. Of course, others will talk about other issues, and those are also valid. They're important. You know, it's not okay that Welby introduced and allowed trans ideology into primary schools, Church of England primary schools, encouraging essentially FGM and gender confusion. That's horrific. What does Scripture say about those who lead little ones into sin? It's horrific. People are going to be talking about that, and they should talk about that because it's horrific. There is space to be talking about more than one thing. We should be talking more than one thing. Thankfully, the Making Report is getting a lot of attention. That's good. I celebrate, I rejoice in that, because that's a horrific injustice and it needs looking at. But there's room for more than one conversation here, and actually more than one conversation is necessary here. And in fact, this isn't even changing the subject, it's just extending it and learning the lessons and applying it, not to yesterday's blind spot, but to today's. And that's what we need to do if we really care about image bearers being victims of injustice.